Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for another. Oh, no, it's the first edition of the Colloquium of the year. So thank you so much for joining us. Today, I have the big pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend, Patricia Basile. If you don't know her, she does fantastic work in the Department of Geography, where she's an assistant professor. Her work is on urban geography, political geography, Latin American geographies, geographies of social movements, and today we will hear about her work on urban commons. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Such a nice full room, so it's feeling very welcomed. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the directors of the Ostrom workshop, for welcoming to this space. My dear colleague Diana for bringing me here. I want to thank Karen and Anna and Kristen for all the support, setting everything up. They've been really helpful. So a lot of what I want to start by prefacing saying that a lot of what I'm going to share is not just focused on one research project, but is actually the kind of cumulative insights and thoughts and reflections that I have been able to build for over about 15 years in working with and in different favela communities in Brazil. Right? So it's not only, and definitely kind of coming from an effort, coming with an effort to engage in theorizing, as the title says. So hopefully it will lead to fruitful discussion. Okay, so. All right. So I wanted to start the presentation by sharing just a very short anecdote, personal anecdote about myself that I think will help set up the presentation. So before my academic life, I was actually an architect and an urban planner, and I worked for about 4 years in Brazil in designing favela upgrading projects and social housing projects. So favela upgrading are projects that try to regularize, like sometimes provide titles for favela residents who don't own the property, the land they occupy. They bring infrastructure, urban infrastructure that doesn't exist, so electricity or water or sewage infrastructure, right? So I worked for a number of years in those projects, and I had the opportunity to engage with some of the communities I was working in, and it led me to kind of create and think about a number of insights in kind of critiquing the work that I was doing, basically, right? I started seeing how upgrading projects were limited. They were important in improving urban infrastructure, but they were limited in actually addressing kind of the structural conditions that led to the creation of favelas in the first place, right? There was also a situation, I was working this project with the extreme east side of São Paulo, in a favela that didn't have proper urban infrastructure. And we spent like about a year designing the project. It was contracted by the city. And then we went to present in the community, like a community center, a bunch of community leaders. And the architect present all these beautiful drawings that we spent way too much time on it. And I remember very clearly this woman, when the presentation ended, got up. And there was a proposition of having all these benches and vases in front of people's houses, right? I remember very clearly this community leader stood up at the end of the presentation and asked, like, who said I want benches in front of my house, right? And that was kind of disorienting for the architect that was presenting, but also very telling to me in how there were these big disconnections between what the city was envisioning that was ideal for that project, what us architects were designing, and what the community and members really wanted it, right? So that brought me to kind of think about questions of community control, of community self-governance that led me kind of to my PhD and to think about the commons, the urban commons as well. If you don't know, favelas are self-built communities in Brazil, historically developed by Black and brown and impoverished Brazilians without access to housing in urban areas. Favelas are considered informal because they do not follow urban or architecture laws and regulations, and because residents often don't own the land they occupy. So I just wanted to start with that reflection. I've also been in an effort in my academic career trying to kind of question the assumptions that we in Brazil as a society have about favelas, of they being unplanned, right, from an urban planning standpoint, ungoverned. There's also a lot of stigma that continues to exist around favelas as they being places of crime and drug dealing activities, which do exist in some favelas, but most people living in favelas are not engaged in these activities. And also kind of thinking about favelas historically through the processes of urbanization of cities in Brazil and the historical makings of favelas and urban informalities as racialized processes. So these are kind of some of the reflections that led to some of the questions I'm going to try to engage today. Hopefully that gives you some kind of background. All right, so I'm from São Paulo, and a lot of my work in favelas have been in São Paulo. It's the largest city in South America. In 2022, there were about 12,000 favelas in Brazil total, which is about 16 million people, about 8.1% of the total population in Brazil. This is more than double than existed in Brazil in 2010, right? So in about 12 years, more than double favelas in total Brazil. About 70% of the total population living in favelas in 2022 were Black and brown. So that also gives you some important information. In São Paulo, favelas represent 15% of the total population. This map shows the spatial distribution of favelas in São Paulo. And you can see some patterns, right? You can see that a lot of them are actually far away from this, what we call historical center of the city, and the surrounding neighborhoods that are primarily middle and high income neighborhoods. So there are questions of movement and mobility in the city, questions of access to resources, education, health, and things like that, leisure. There's also the largest favela in São Paulo is Paraisópolis, which is also the third largest favela in Brazil, which has about 15,000 residents. So that gives you also a little bit about scale in terms of favelas. So I'm here to talk about the urban commons. So the urban commons has gained quite a lot of attention in, I would say, the last decade or maybe even more, because of these conflicts that exist in cities, right? Kind of neoliberal policies, urban enclosures, and all of that privatization of public spaces and resources. Despite all this interest and a lot of publications coming out, I will say I believe that the urban commons is still a concept in the makings, right? And maybe even in dispute, right? There are different perspectives and different understanding about, well, the commons and what the urban commons mean as well, right? So there are perspectives about the urban commons in relationship to kind of access to resources, so more in the line of pool of common resources, questions of property, or the commons or the urban commons in terms of kind of social and political relations. So a lot of questions that are still kind of unanswered or in the process of being answered, of like, what does the labor of constructing the urban commons look like? By whom is it performed, and how and when, right? Thinking about time. There are also questions about the commons in the city, in the urban, or the urban commons, which are kind of different things. So as I mentioned, the questions that bring me to the urban commons, and when I started my research in favelas, I wasn't actually engaging with this kind of theoretical framework, but are questions of collective governance, self-governance, community control in the context of Brazilian favelas. And maybe thinking about two questions, right? Like, what does the urban commons theoretically can add to our understanding of favelas, and what do favelas and favela experiences can add to the theoretically understanding of the urban commons, right? So kind of two different questions that are connected. Right. So a lot of my thinking and kind of theorizing also come from my engagement with this research group, which is made up of researchers, mostly Brazilian, from all these universities in Brazil and abroad. During the pandemic, we started meeting bi-weekly, reading the literature on the commons and urban commons and having discussions. And we organized, in 2021, we organized an online seminar that had like 93 some presentations. So a lot of discussion, and a lot of my understanding kind of comes up as well from the contributions of this group. These are kind of my goals in terms of an intervention, right? What do I hope to get out of from this presentation? I think I want to bring questions of who gets to produce theory and thinking about the Latin American context. And thinking about how a lot of the theories that we use, right, are not produced within those spaces or those contexts. Often Latin America is seen or used as a case study, but not necessarily a theory producing region, right? So engaging with that, who gets to produce theory, who gets to produce urban theory, who gets to produce commons theory. Bringing the realities that there are a wealth of experiences and knowledges within these communities that are often either not considered, not engaged with.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, don't.
It's okay. It's okay.
He's like, finally agreeing with you, no doubt.
That's great. There's agreement.
Okay, we got it. We got it.
Knowledges that are completely ignored and not only produced by academics, but by artists, by writers, by community leaders and members. So engaging with those questions as well and intervening in that. And also kind of my life goal as like an academic pursuit to kind of challenge the assumptions we have about favelas, about how they inform policy and culture, and maybe even how they can, which is my intentions, how their experiences can inform our theoretical engagement with the urban commons. All right. So I did want to try to bring a kind of working definition that I'm going to engage with of the urban commons here, influenced by some of these works, not many of them that are also not represented here, but definitely these. So in centering favelas, in my attempt to theorize the urban commons, I draw from Marxist and feminist scholars, many of them from Latin America, many of them not represented here. Urban commons is contextual, relational, plural. As urban, they refer to processes, relations, activities happening under specific historical, geographical, material, symbolic conditions that are not isolated in themselves, but rather connected to broader processes of urbanization and racial capitalism. The urban commons is plural, place-based, built in the everyday, always being made and remade instead of being fixed in material condition, space, and time, and constitutes a key site of struggles for communities' social reproduction, their survivals and lives, and their everyday. It thus comprises of unique and collective social, spatial, and cultural practices and knowledges and ways of being in the world. Because of its contextual and relational nature, the urban commons presents evolving practices, spaces, language, strategies, connections that are informed by past ones, and also imaginative of the possibilities and practices of the future. This urban commons is spatialized, creating territories that are inseparable from the bodies that produce and reproduce them. So I understand the urban commons as a social relation produced from cooperative, collective, embodied, and territorialized labor, in most cases performed by Black and Brown women identified peoples in their efforts to guarantee their social reproduction. Such cooperation and collectivity refer to what Raquel Gutierrez calls communitary weavings, and I have the citation here. The urban commons as a social relation bring forward politics of life-affirming inhabitation. And I use this word because I'm a housing scholar, so I think about land in relation to housing. The work of social reproduction of those who hold intersectional identities and are constantly being violated and killed by racial capitalism, but has survived through these histories. So now I turn to favelas and bring their experiences and realities to describe how I see these urban commons materializing, right? So spaces in favelas are collectively built historically. I call them collectively built because the labor of building them is collectivized, right? One example of that is what we call in Portuguese mutirão de laje. Laje is a concrete slab that is built in a house to build a house or to add additional floors, right? Mutirão is a word that I don't believe has a translation to English, but it really means kind of a collective effort project or action, right? It has that meaning of collectivity embodied in action. So mutirão is the process in which neighbors, relatives, friends come together to build a concrete slab, most times during the weekends on a Sunday where people are not working, right? Such type of collective construction it's historical, so it has contributed to the making of houses in favelas for a very long time. And it contributes to the making of these, what I'm calling the urban commons, and the building of space, right? Not only the building of space, but the building of a collective self within favelas. So in the day of the mutirão, right, people come together. Men usually work in the construction of the laje. They build the wooden frame, right, that will shape the slab. They set up the metal mash where the concrete will be poured. They mix the concrete, right, with sand, cement, gravel, and water, and they pour it into the wooden frame, right, to make up. That's a day's work of several people working together. Here there are a few pictures. The knowledge of how this happens is passed through friends and through relationships, right? And through generations as well. So people can always be contributing to these efforts and can actually also acquire kind of construction skills, right? Become a way of getting a job as well. At the same time, women prepare food to be shared collectively as a celebration and a reward after the slab is finished. This work of making food is often invisible, right? Not present in these pictures, but is inherent to this practice of the mutirão, because after the slab is done, there's always the reward of the food, of sharing the food together. This is a very gender division of labor, right? That kind of reaffirm the social divisions in our patriarchal society. But these divisions are also being challenged at the same time. There are a lot of collectives in favelas that are training women in construction skills and bringing them to these efforts as well, in like renovating houses and building new houses. The act of inviting others to be part of this endeavor is a process in itself that constructs and maintains this collectivity in favelas, right? So being part of a mutirão reinforces the collective bonds that are present and exist through solidarity, cooperation, and mutuality in favelas. So again, this is a key practice in how the material realities of favelas being made, but also how the building of this collectivity happens. Oops. All right. So Spaces in favelas are also inherently tied to people's social reproduction. This is a drawing that I made of a house in this community called São Remo Favela in São Paulo that demonstrate this process of how the houses are inherently tied to people's survival, generational survival. So this house belongs to, it's not his real name, but I'll call it Mr. José. He's 61 years old and he's been living in this community since he was 25. He originally came from Bahia, a northeastern state of São Paulo, to this community where his cousin already lived to look for a better job, right, with his wife and a young daughter. So they built a small wooden shack in a community that all the houses looked like this, right? Is the one that is signed 1981. So they didn't have electricity, they used candles, they didn't have water, they had to walk to a municipal facility to get water, there wasn't any sewage systems, etc. So with time, Mr. José's family grew, right? They had 3 more children, the children grew up, got married, had children of themselves. So the house actually represents and shows this change in their familial structure, right? So Mr. José actually was able to move to another piece of land and build a house made out of bricks, so more sturdy, with eventually electricity came to the community, so they have electricity. He works in construction, so he built a second floor because the house got crowded with the new kids, so to have more bedrooms. When his first daughter got married, he built a 3rd floor for the daughter to live with her husband, and then he built a 4th and 5th floor, which is a terrace, kind of a leisure socially for social gatherings, and also where he stores his tools, right? So this house, this material condition of these houses, and this is not an unusual story in favelas. This is actually a story that repeated itself that repeats itself in talking to people about in knowing the history of their houses. When I asked Mr. José about how his house became such a tall building, he said right away, "Are we going to live on the street? As they get married, we keep building up." So I think this image kind of represents really well how the space is connected to generation social reproduction. So the next, I want to talk about the alley, right? Or we call in Portuguese, we call beco, which are the little streets that are the result of the houses, right? So they're the leftover spaces from the houses that make up the paths through which people can get from one point to the other, right? That are a product of the historical evolution of the houses, but are also in themselves very important for the community as a whole, right? There are spaces of care for children, right? So after children come back from school, it's often where you will find children playing and their grandmother looking after them or a neighbor looking after them, right? This proximity of families living closer together, neighbors, knowing your neighbors, also helps with care for the elderly, care for the sick, providing a meal when needed, right? So it also results in a kind of very tight-knit networks of care that I'm calling networks of care that was very present and demonstrated itself very visibly during COVID, and I'll talk more about that later. So how these spaces are also a product of these configurations, but also kind of contribute to this collectivity, collective self. So the beco, the alley, they are spaces of encounter, they are spaces of play. They are almost kind of a continuities as people's houses. If you walk in a favela on a Saturday, people often have their doors open, they're sitting on the step. That's how they're catching up with their neighbors, right? So they represent and encompass the collectivity and community in the community's everyday life. There's also, I want to just point out to to these pictures don't show it very well, but in favela it's often common to see the electricity cables and water connections. And historically, those were very important as well before utilities companies got to favelas, because people used to share connection to water or electricity when they have it, right? So those connections also came through and are visible in these alleys. Okay. All right, so alleys are also important because they are spaces of representation and the makings of culture and identity, right? So, for example, graffiti, things like graffiti, or things like baile funky, right? Which are these street parties that people come together that are historically very important for representation and culture and resistance, and the use of space in Brazil is very stigmatized and policed, but very important historic for the makings of these communities. So here are a few pictures of how these parties occupy space and are materialized through these spaces. These networks of care became very present during COVID. During COVID, Jair Bolsonaro was president in Brazil, and he was a COVID denialist. There was no policy that was created to support these communities during COVID, right? So health policy recommendations like stay at home or isolate weren't really viable for these communities. Like they didn't have an extra room for people to stay in, or they couldn't stop going to work. Otherwise they would lose all their means of living, right? So the organizations, collective organizations, and these networks were the people that came together to create policies to support these communities during COVID, right? And prevent even more disaster and death during these times. So they created locally informed and driven solutions to local problems, right? They would, for example, close off a school and with partnerships with government and other institutions, created a kind of hospital infirmary where people could isolate if they were sick, where they could be away from their families, right? These practices were very well kind of talked about, specifically in social media. And they usually talked about through a framework of interdependence and connection with favela communities elsewhere as well. So it wasn't just about protecting their own community. It was also about sharing this knowledge and these local solutions with other communities so they can protect themselves as well. So there's this idea of networks of care, localized networks of care, was really embedded and really visible during COVID. Going faster than I thought I would.
You're doing great.
All right, so there's also, I haven't talked much about it, but many favelas have collective groups or organizations, right, that historically have been very important in bringing policies, in bringing upgrading, in bringing urban infrastructure and money for youth centers for developing space. And this is just an example. This is a friend of mine. She's an architect and urban planner, Esther Carro. She's from Jardim Colombo, which is within the Paraisópolis favela. And she's done an amazing job in doing these workshops to bring kids and community members together to think about how they can change and improve their space, right? So this was an area, this picture right here, was an area that that accumulated trash historically. So there was a lot of trash and obviously cockroaches and all the things that come with trash. And they came together, they did all these workshops and kind of community parties to workshop together what they wanted the space to be, and led by this architect Esther, which I greatly admire. And they came up with an idea of building a kind of collective meeting space and playground for kids, right? And this is what it looks like today. They've been able to create partnerships with private companies to get funding. They've done fundraising publicly. They've done a good job in also publicizing the work that they're doing and inviting people in, even from outside of favelas, bringing volunteers to help do this work. So this is just one case where there's very clear kind of spatial transformation and governing of space through these collective efforts within these communities. So I've talked about many of these, but I just wanted to kind of reinforce 4 different points in how I believe favelas or the experiences of favelas can inform the theorizing of the urban commons, right? The first is plurality, right? I believe that this is not the only way through which urban commons happens within urban spaces globally, right? But I do believe that these experiences do add to our understanding of the urban commons in very unique ways. And a similarity, other experiences could do the same, right? Experiences that are often overlooked. So arguing for the plurality of urban commons broadly. I did also want to reinforce this idea of territoriality of territory in how urban commons are contextual and relational, how they're constant under construction as the struggle for community social reproduction, how they are embodied, so they are inseparable from the peoples, the bodies that make them, right, and remake them. So this connection, we can think about the literature on cuerpo territorio from Latin America, the connections of territory and bodies, which is often in relationship to more non-urban areas. So thinking about this connection in urban areas. This territoriality is also, as I mentioned, cooperative, collective, embodied through collective labor. So I wanted to highlight the temporalities of urban commons and how they're made and remade through history, which I've already repeated, built in the everyday life, right? It is through these everyday examples that I'm able to make these claims, and always historically evolving as well. I wanted to bring the question of intersectionality or intersectional identities, I didn't talk much about it, but this is very present in favelas, how women identify Black and Brown in other realities, indigenous or minoritized individuals are the ones often that are doing this labor in their struggles to protect themselves and to survive, right? So here I like to quote Beatriz Nascimento. She's a Brazilian scholar, historic, poet, activist that documented and theorized the histories of Black people in communities in Brazil. And she argued that for conceptualizations of material and immaterial dimensions of territory in the production of space. So I think this question of material, immaterial is also present within this proposition of what I'm bringing for the urban commons. And finally, the urban commons as a social relation, right, as I mentioned before. So just a kind of final reflection, I put it on the top to be continued because I haven't published this work, and I do hope to publish in the future. I think it's very much in development, so I will welcome your kind of questions or reflections. I may not have answers for all of them, but they will definitely be important for me. I do think there is an effort here to kind of think about how these experiences can not only help challenge assumptions, and I'm in no way trying to romanticize poverty or precarity, obviously. I'm just, I think, trying to eliminate these realities that are realities of spatial and territorial governance, even though, and there are logics through which these communities are materialized and are planned, despite not being through kind of the technical and paradigms, right, of urban planning and policy. I also think there are a lot of opportunities to think about policy, right? Usually these policies that are created for favelas, upgrading or the production of these very large housing complexes, they completely ignore these realities, right? They put people in these small apartments in these huge complexes that ignore these networks, ignore the need for the networks for people to survive, and the spatial configuration. So thinking about how do these realities can also help inform policy. And I think more broadly, thinking about spatial governance within cities, and Brazil has a history of participatory budgeting, right? It's a practice that was created in the south of Brazil, in having people in communities actually decide how public funding is spent and invested in their communities, right? So I think there's a lot of space for these type of practices in kind of democratic decision-making for policy and public investment and improvement in these communities as well. So these are some of the realities that I wanted to discuss. I do want to thank you all again. Thank you for my geography colleagues for showing up for me. Thank you for everyone who's aligned. So I think I did well on time. So I do look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
We'll keep the queue, but maybe first, as per usual, if there's a student maybe who'd like to go first, not a student for long now, but and then Claudia will turn to you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm sorry if you mentioned this. I was late. I was presenting something. But have you touched on the role of militias and their participation within the favelas itself? I love when people are talking about favelas. I think we should be studying favelas for sure. There's so much that can come out of it. But I'm just wondering, like, within, the intersectionality, within all of that work, if you're looking also at the role of the militias and, quite frankly, violence and, the role that we know that the drug lords, they can dictate what happens inside their territories or in specific places, what you can or cannot do, where you can go in, where you cannot go. And so I'm wondering, like, if you have thought about it, if you've addressed it at all.
Yeah. What's your name?
Perilous.
That's a good question. Thank you. I did mention something very brief in the beginning, but I think that's a great point, right? It would be naive of me to say that that's not a reality. Militias are very present, even more so and increasingly so, for example, in cities like Rio de Janeiro, right? Where they have a lot of control over spatial governance, where people get to live, what people get to do with space. And historically, also, many favelas have had drug trafficking gangs operating within them that do have some say and control. I do not study those questions because my goal within my broader work is actually to challenge the stigmas and the assumptions that come from those realities, right? Because they're very predominant. There's still a lot of people in Brazil that associate favelas with militia and drug trafficking exclusively, right? So in my effort to kind of challenge those images, I acknowledge that they exist, but my effort is intentional in kind of bringing, okay, these exist in some places, but there's also a lot of other things that exist that contribute to everyday and community governance broadly. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Okay, I think we saw Claudia next.
Thank you, Patricia. Very interesting work. I wonder, and actually tying this to your comment about Rio de Janeiro, whether these realities vary across cities. So that would be very interesting from a comparative perspective to see if those realities in Rio de Janeiro apply, or given the level of violence in Rio de Janeiro, those realities might be manipulated by drug leaders, while in the other scenario it will be different. So it will be very interesting, a comparative research.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done in cities like Rio and São Paulo, I'll say. There's actually a lot less work done in like cities in the Northeast and in the North, which also have very different realities and are a lot less visible in kind of Anglophone academia, I would say. So I think, yeah, the idea of comparison is important, especially thinking in kind of parallel, right? What are common practices that we can bring together, but also what are unique differences that will tell us more about those specific places, right? So that's a great point. Thank you.
I think we had Diana next.
Okay. I want to make sure that no student wants to go
I know. Yeah.
first. Elisa, no. Oh, I thought that was like a maybe. No, okay. No, didn't mean to put you on the spot, of course. I can go. I wanted to thank you because I think one of the things that you do in your presentation is really challenge those assumptions. So one definitely is the profound anti-Blackness that comes with how these spaces are stigmatized, and that is so common in, you know, in general knowledge production, but particularly in the Latin American traditions, who still reinforce that idea of Black spaces as a spaces of, and brown spaces as a spaces of lack, deficiency, criminality. And actually thinking of them as alternative forms of spatial governance, I think is really, really, really powerful. Also, in showing the importance of social reproduction in those spaces, I think is key. It made me think too, your question about, Marily's question about gangs made me think about some recent work coming from Latin American scholars claiming that gang is really a myth, that gangs do not exist, that those are forms of political violence that are closely tied to the state. So the idea of the gang as an outcast or gangs as being against the state is really not the reality for Brazil or Mexico or Colombia, or we can keep going, you know, a corner in Baltimore in the US. My question, so that was the long comment. I apologize for that. My question is if you have thought about maybe the conversation with waste geographies. I was thinking of that as you saw, as you showed us the specific example of these alternative infrastructure, the park that they created in terms of, I don't know, debris or gleaning or thinking about some scholars who have been thinking about racial capitalism and waste as part of this. That was my question.
Good question. Yeah, I would love to learn more if you can share the literature on the questioning of gangs, because I'm not familiar with it.
I will share it with you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there are quite a lot of scholars that do engage with that from these communities from those standpoints, right? From the standpoint of waste or water, right? Or electricity specifically. I myself haven't engaged directly with them, but I think they do add, especially, and something I don't focus particularly, but I think there's something I didn't mention. When we think about identities and who makes the commons, I think there's like an ecological dimension that I would bring kind of a multi-species perspective to this. And I think those scholars definitely engage with that, or scholars of water definitely engage with that. And in my more recent work in thinking about the development of favelas historically in the city, I am starting to engage with that because in how favelas started in the city of São Paulo, they were always in the lowlands of rivers, right? So often that reality and being in close to those rivers was often an excuse or the rationale that was used to move them, right? So it was like, oh, they're filthy, they are producing disease, right? So there's this very direct connection with waste or with the river, right? That is used to create a certain discourse, also a certain stigma about these communities, and also justify their movement, right? So the question I'm asking today is like, how do these communities end up in these peripheries, right? The truth is they didn't start there. The first favelas in São Paulo were actually in the historical downtown, and they've been progressively moved through these policies, right? So I think those scholars will actually be very helpful in thinking about that. Thank you.
I think we had Jess and then Julia.
Cool. Okay, I don't know. Well, anything at all. This was really, really interesting and fascinating. And one thing I'm sort of trying to think about is thinking about theorizing urban commons. Sounds like as part of this project. I would love to hear, after having spent so long thinking about favelas in particular, how you see them in relation to broader understandings of urban commons or other examples. So for example, you talked, I found especially interesting, like your history of thinking about architecture and spaces and the ways in which, in some ways, it's impossible to separate the concept and idea of favelas from the space, the physical space that facilitates them. And if you hadn't said that, I'd be like, oh, well, maybe urban commons are not that different from pretty much, any form of sort of, it's like a cooperation built on a social fabric and any sort of level of density of population. Right? Really general, really big. But the two things that stand out from your conversation about this, and the third would have been history, so I'm glad you brought that up. But one is the sort of physicality of the space, the nature of the space, and the extent to which it is so important or not in facilitating favelas as urban commons. And the second is culture. And I mean that in a sort of sense of sort of values that are specific to this particular region, which again, my understanding of is a little bit more top down from sort of world value survey things, but I would expect that to be especially important, is that these care networks you're talking about seem to be both facilitated by this space and place, but also a broader sort of cultural orientation within Brazil. And I'm sort of curious how you see these three things interacting to really make favelas a real sort of urban commons as you see it. So theorizing of urban commons, favelas as urban commons, how culture, architectural space, and third thing, history really are integral in making favelas and urban commons, or could anything sort of fit that bill?
Yeah, okay. I was kind of expecting that question would come up. So thank you for asking it.
I was asking it, so.
Yeah, no. So I think the first question about the urban, right? And could it be that this is anywhere, or what is specific about this that makes it urban? Is that
More or less.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I think about here is kind of drawing from like Lefebvrean discussions of like planetary urbanization, right? So questions of how there's a differentiation between what is a city as a localized kind of place, right? Versus what is the urban as being these kind of globalized, interconnected processes that connect these different locations, right? So if you think about the city of São Paulo and how it is connected to a lot of different cities throughout the world, right? If you think about globalization and these networks of infrastructure, of information, right? So tied to kind of understanding of spatialization of globalization and all these connectivity, right? So I think there's a little bit of questioning, what is the urban, right? And how is it different from the rural or no urban, right? So I think there's a little bit of that, right? In thinking what is unique about these communities that, or these realities that make them urban. And I think one thing that I would bring is that if you look at informal settlements, or they have other names in different countries in Latin America, right? I've been to some, for example, in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, and they actually look very similar to the São Remo favela. They had these like many of them has several floors. They had the stairs outside. Everything happened in the alley, on the street. They have the markets, right? People use the bottom floor for like additional income, so they create a market. Families lived in the same building, so very similar kind of practices, but they're also very unique in their own histories, right, of place, and histories that I'm not familiar with because I visited for a day, right? But I could see these crazy spatial similarities with the community I was working with in São Paulo. And so that is to say that these are not unique to favelas in Brazil, right? These are, and that's why I think when I say plurality and also contextual, geographically, historically, right? To say, and I think that's a very broad answer, but to say that they are connected in unique ways, but they're also unique in their own ways. And I think and that speaks to your question about space and culture and history, right? Because the combination of those things, and people often choose to look at certain aspects of things, right? And so I haven't done a lot of work connected to culture expressions, for example, but I know they're very important, like, because they were there, right? Every alley I turned, there was a different kind of graffiti painting. There were workshops that the community center did of graffiti, of music, of samba, right? So they are present and they are part of what this community is and what favelas are in Brazil. Historically. So I'm not sure if I am answering your question. Do you want to add or?
No, I just wanted to sort of hear, like, at the end of the day, if one of the goals is to think about a theory of commons and what makes something an urban commons, I think thinking critically about the role not only of space, which seems inherently important, but also these questions, okay, are there, the histories, obviously, right? But then specific characteristics of culture. We know, for example, familial care networks are much more central to existence there than they are here. Very atomistic, very individual. I could imagine that really changing what it would mean for an urban commons. And so I was sort of trying to imagine myself how to think about a theory. But I don't want to.
I will follow up just to say that I think in thinking about the urban commons as social political practices and politics, I think also that means that they are spatialized and territorialized in unique ways contextually, but in being politics and practices, they also reproduce in many different places, right? So actually, someone has asked me this question before about thinking the US, because ever since I moved to Indiana, I started doing some work in Indianapolis around housing and evictions. And someone asked me that, well, how do you see the urban commons in Indianapolis versus São Paulo? And I think that's a very difficult question, because there are all these historical, geographical dynamics of what is legal and illegal, how legality is enforced or legitimized or not, right? In Brazil, people have occupied land without property titles for over centuries, right? And here, if you occupy the meadow for a few weeks, you get snipers on the roof, right? So there are questions about what is legality and what is illegality, how the law is legitimized and enforced or not, right? And when we talk about, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but in thinking about urban informalities, the discussion about urban informalities in the Global South is that oftentimes it's associated with poverty and precarity, like these realities. But there's also the informalities of the rich. There are many kind of clubs and malls in São Paulo, the same city, that have been produced and spatialized in informal ways, not following regulations, with illegalities in their title. Those are not called informal or not policed and policed as illegal, right? So I think there are questions of legality, illegality, legitimacy, and illegitimacy that are very different in those two contexts. But I do see the urban commons. There's an organization that I have visited many times called the Kepra Institute in Indianapolis. And they are a Black-led organization that they have a community garden, and they have all these types of programs in funding Black-led businesses, and they're creating a community land trust, which means the community ownership of land to preserve affordability and the ability for them to stay in their community, because the community is being gentrified. So is spatialized and territorialized very differently than any of this that I'm showing, but it still involves social and political practices for the struggles for these communities' survival, right? And that's what I mean. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that last part is better.
I have the cue. So Adri, then Olga, and we'll keep going.
Thank you so much for this talk.
Julia.
You first?
You can go there first. Okay, so Adri, Julia, yes, sorry, Julia, Olga, Dan, and I have the cue. Sorry, Julia.
So,
Adri first,
okay.
then Julia.
Professor Basile, thank you so much for this talk. I think it's deepening this narrative of favelas are just this place of violence, right? That led and has been leading today in Brazil, for instance, in Rio de Janeiro, the police violence increased almost 700%, 7% in the last, I think, year because this and a lot of like police intervention based on these narratives also and like show the clarity that we have in favelas. So I want to come back to the COVID time because I think that time in favelas and not only favelas, but show it how much these commons network or these like networks of care really sustain and efficiently made the information flow, the resource flow, when like the government and the federal government with the whole structure of this organization of the state could not efficiently take care and made like the people survive, right? So these bottom up initiatives in place that are taking us violent of this place that need to be under control and healed and like planned actually were the place that we saw more efficiently the care and the network and also material information, people, medical, everything. And actually we turned like the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, I think in São Paulo também turned a model of how to do things. So if you can like spend some time like explaining more these in details.
Yeah, I have a whole paper just on this, so if you're interested, you should look it up. Yeah, so what they did is truly amazing, and I wasn't there. I was sitting in my home here in Indiana, had food, and wasn't concerned about any type of the insecurity that they were facing. So kind of acknowledging the privilege that I had to just be looking at them and admire them, but not actually living through them, right? But they did an essential job in providing information, because I don't know if you read about COVID in Brazil, but the amount of disinformation that was being disseminated was absurd, right? About the disease, about how to prevent the disease, about what policies that were being created, about what things people had access to. So they did a tremendous job in using things they already had to provide information for people to actually know what was happening. So they use social media, which is very big. Facebook is very big in Brazil, like social media groups. They use something that was used historically in Brazil as like these cars with big sound with speakers, and they would go around saying like what was COVID, how it was spread, what did you need to protect yourself. And this has been a practice that existed in favelas for like 100 years, right? That's how community radio was created in favelas. So they created outside external washing places, like sinks for people to wash their hands, right? They use an infrastructure that has also been used historically in Brazil. It's called the street president, right? So basically assigning one person, one individual that lived on the street or that alley to be responsible for taking care of that alley, right? So they would go weekly visit every home outside, knock on the door. How are you doing? Any symptoms? Do you need to isolate someone to control the spread of this disease locally? So Paraisópolis, which was the community that kind of did this very well, had like over 100 people that were street presidents and were able to check on people every week to make sure to control the dissemination of the virus. And these are just they made these community organizations that I mentioned, they make like hundreds of meals every day, right? Because people were losing their jobs, so they couldn't eat. So they collected donations and they would make hundreds of meals that people could go outside and get and feed their family. So there were a number of kind of ways that they ensured their community safety efficiently that are not new, and that's some of the things that are in the paper. They're not new. They're actually built through these practices that already existed and through these knowledges of their communities, and that's why they were efficient, right? They also had a very very important discourse of kind of the realities of the necropolitics of the state and how the state was trying to kill them in not creating policies for those communities, right? And that was present in their discourse and their understanding of those realities. So yeah, it's a great, I think it also brings a lot to the discussion of a policy and community control and governance that is really unique. Thank you for that question.
Julia.
Thank you. Patricia, it's so nice to hear about your work at length. Thank you for preparing this talk, and you're such a great speaker.
I agree.
Okay, so as a listener new to your story, something that I was wondering about was just like a slide of some basics about land rights. Like what's at risk when people are working together to build the concrete floors, like especially seeing the slide of your beautiful drawings of one person going from 1 story to 5 in 40 years. Like what threatens that? And you're in the discussion, you're talking about it when you're talking about, you know, the state moving favelas away from river bottoms and other places. So, and it just makes me also imagine like primary data collection with the people taking place or taking part in the building of the floors. Like, how do they view the investments versus the risks of what they're engaged in doing?
Yeah.
So I thought that would have been some solidifying background information, even though it may vary a ton, and
Yeah.
just as a central part of the story.
Yeah, that's a very important question. I'm sorry that I didn't provide. I was very concerned that I was going to speak too much, and I spoke. I think I could have spoken more. I could have said more. So I appreciate the kind of clarifying or questions or about that. And I think that could be its own presentation, right? So I'll talk about this community of that drawing specifically to talk more about that, right? So the São Remo favela is one that occupies land. It's in the neighborhood. It's called the Butantã. It's actually close to the downtown. It's not very peripheral. So it's kind of an interesting location for that community. But then when the community started, there was nothing there. Like it was agricultural land. Right. And the reason it started was because there was a movement from the University of São Paulo, which is kind of the most important public university in Brazil, to create a campus in that neighborhood, right? So they had buildings in downtown, and they actually wanted to create a large scale campus, and they started acquiring land through different means, right? The administration of the university, I mean, right? And so at the same time, a few houses were popping up in like surrounding areas. They didn't own land, right? But no one was claiming the land, right? Someone owned it. It was privately owned actually, but no one was there kind of using it, right? So, and that's historically, that's how favelas appear as a kind of parallel process, but it's usually land that's not being owned, right? A little background on this question of land not being owned is that in the context of Brazil had a military dictatorship that ended, and a new constitution was written in '88. in this constitution and its development, it acknowledges the social function of land and property. What does that mean? It means that property is private property, but also has to fulfill its social function whenever it is, wherever it is placed. So that means in an urban area, property should not be standing empty, or a building should not be standing empty in the downtown when it could be housing people, or it could be a business, right? So there are different kind of urban planning ways and tools that the Brazilian state had created to enforce those. We can have a whole nother discussion if they work or not, like incremental increasing taxes, right? Up until the person losing the property, right? So that's kind of a little bit more background, but so today this community, most of the land that it occupies is owned by the university, right? A lot of the people who lives in the community have worked or work in the university, right? There's actually a wall that separates the campus from the favela. And today there are actually gates. So the gates are open during the week. During the weekend, they're actually closed. And the campus is actually a place that people go like bike and run. So it's a kind of parkish kind of vibe, right? But that is closed. Those gates are closed to the community. There's people in the São Remo favela that own their property. So it's not all owned by the university. There's people that actually have their property titles. So the tenure dynamics, right? The land tenure ownership dynamics within that community is actually quite complex because, and then at the same time, the municipality, the city of São Paulo has tried to upgrade this community several times, right? It has tried to implement sewage infrastructure, water, cultural center, several things. And the university has blocked it because it's the owner of most of the land, right? So that hasn't stopped the community from building 5 floors, right? Because a lot of people that live there are actually employees in the university, right? Usually kind of under precarious conditions, but a lot of people, they will tell you is like, well, look at this, like it's so dense. It's like, no one's gonna come and bulldoze this, right? So I think today in kind of favela realities, it really depends, right? I think newer communities, because there's still new favelas being created, right? As we saw in like 12 years, is more than double. There's kind of more threats in terms of the city coming to take them out, right? Or someone claiming this is my land, and oftentimes it's public land, so it's owned by the city, or sometimes it's privately owned. That if compared to these older communities, and there are favelas in Rio that are 100 years old, right? And they are thousands of people live in it, right? So it's a neighborhood, right? So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but there are like a lot of different dynamics, I think, that play a part into, they're also obviously kind of real estate and type of dynamics that influence what community gets bulldozed and not, right? So if it's a neighborhood that has been, is the focus, for example, of city investment, of a private-public partnership, for example, right? The city there's legislation, for example, in São Paulo that allows for private-public partnerships in developing a specific neighborhood to bring more real estate, to bring more taxes, right? And that says that, for example, if you're a builder, you build a 12-story building, you can build additional floors if you save a percentage of the apartments for low-income housing, right? Or if you invest part of your money in this park right here, right? So if it is a neighborhood that are like these types of interests going in place, right, it's more likely that a community will face a threat of removal, right? There are also environmental questions, right? A lot of communities are still in the valleys, in lowland areas, right? So there's floods, there's areas that the houses, if it's strong rain, the houses will fall apart. So they're like actual physical threats. But then this question, well, why are they there in the first place? But so that I mean, that's a very long answer to say that there are a lot of different dynamics that play a part into kind of the security of tenure of these communities, depending on where they are. Was that helpful?
Yes.
Okay, we can talk more about it later if you want.
Patricia, thank you so much for that. I kept some notes. It's theorizing. What you're trying to do, if I understood it correctly, is theorizing kind of a global, or what it means globally to have an urban commons. I see a lot of potential in my limited knowledge of resisting those ideas of that urban commons in the concept of how you described it is only a production in the South or in a production in certain places in the world. So as you were talking, and these are totally unrelated because instances, because they are contextual and they are historical. I was thinking of the space of social reproduction in the old tenements, for example, that are happening in this part of the world, and legacies of which still exist in so-called ethnic neighborhoods, especially in megacities in the US, but also in my neck of the woods and in the production of space in groups in France, for example, that are relocated outside of the city limits. You wouldn't call that a favela, but it is a favela in a way. So I think your work, or the trailer parks that are incorporated in the city, I live close to one of them, and the social reproduction that is taking place in those areas, and the culture and the idea of reciprocity, I don't think they have been even touched on in our society. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit on how your work might connect all those places and elevate it into a more concrete theory of the urban commons.
That's a very big question.
No, so
Yeah.
because you're looking at people. and
Yeah,
how
yeah.
they take place and
Yeah.
how they make their relationships.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think it's an opportunity, right? I think it opens up an opportunity to think about these threads that you were talking about, right? These places that people are often under threat, right? They're often having to protect themselves from different things, right? They're often moved around, right? They're often so these are these are struggles for survival, right? For everyday survival, right? And I acknowledge that there's also a privilege in even thinking about, oh, is this the urban commons or not? Because I'm not the one trying to live every day, trying to survive these threats, right? So I do acknowledge that privilege in itself. But so I think it is an opportunity for us to think about even now more as we see these like global threats, right? We have the climate crisis, we have increasing authoritarian governments and fascism. And so I think these communities, are they fighting fascism and the climate crisis? I would argue that they are in their own ways, because they are fighting for their own survival within these contexts, right? These historical geographical contexts. So I think they offer us kind of tools, right, for us to learn about resistance, about organizing, about care, about social reproduction. and how that is tied to space. Because I mean, the house I live, I didn't build it, right? I don't actually know who built it. I bought it. It has already been renovated at least twice, right? But I haven't been living in my neighborhood for very long, so I don't actually have a very deep connection to a network of people there. There's my chair, Justin, actually is my neighbor, so I have that connection. But so what does it mean for me? Like if I get sick, I know my geography community will come to my house and bring me food because we do that for each other. But I wouldn't be able to knock on my neighbor's door and maybe say, oh, I'm really need help right now. Can you help me? So how does these realities and practices and ways of being, what can I learn from them, right? In Bloomington, I mean, there's a lot of folks that are in house and they are constantly being moved around, right? What are these practices? What can I learn from them in being in solidarity with the unhoused community in Bloomington, and maybe advocating for them, using my privilege to advocate for them, right? So I think I'm going on a tangent, but I think it is an opportunity. I think these realities, and I think that was my intention, is like make them visible, and try to learn from them, right? And try to connect them with all the other struggles that actually are very different, but also similar, right? I think we can feel closer to each other in these struggles that are global, but are also local, right? Does that make sense?
Of course.
I want to be mindful of time, and we have a long queue. So I want to collect 3 questions, give Patricia the opportunity to answer, and then other 3, give her the opportunity to answer, and see if we have more time. So Dan, you're next in my queue.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with expanding the purview a little bit, both historically and regionally, I suppose. But I also want, the main thing I want is disentangling the commons aspect from the urban aspect, because those, I think, those could usefully be treated separately, and then to see what effects come out of it, because you have lots of informal communities historically and today that develop in rural areas as well and have their own precariousness of tenure of everything. What commonalities do we see between those sort of informal rural and informal urban? And then what is the effect of the urbanity? And it seems to me, I mean, this is partly what's so fascinating about it to me is that so many very diverse theories of urban communities might actually be in agreement. I don't, you know, how often are Marx and Hayek in agreement? But in this case, and Jane Jacobs, right, for example. And so, I mean, obviously it's extremely rich, and it's an area where I think, you know, you're on the edge of a potential sort of flood of great literature. But I do think it might be useful just to separate, you know, not fully, because you want to tie them together at the back end, but what are the different aspects?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Jess brought that up and I forgot to answer. Oh, so you want to collect more?
Yes, I'll collect 3 and then give you opportunity to answer. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Angelina, thank you.
I have a question related to Adriana's question about COVID. So I think like I'm kind of more interested in seeing the time of COVID and now as kind of a like late COVID time and how we're still seeing some continuous effects and the remnants of that time and the social relationships and the community efforts from that. And I think like to me like this COVID time really it's not like really like so unique as in terms of community efforts to combat like a pandemic or to kind of confront like a threat. But I also see how like it marked kind of a very recent intensified awareness of people's distance and like spatial awareness, like social distancing. That's the popular discourse in the US. And like I'm from China, so I'm also like familiar with like what was going on in China with COVID restrictions and how like a similar urban feature in Chinese cities, we'll call it urban village, was always seen as this threat to public health. And it really gave the government like a lot more legitimacy and excuse to crack down on urban villages and urban like rural to urban migrant workers there during COVID. So I think my question is related to like how like what are some continuing effect you see from the COVID time on urban commons as in favelas that you're theorizing with? And is there also any like changing perceptions of favelas and the communal efforts there as maybe like a good model of public health that like we can, you know, reflect on that now? Yeah, kind of the two questions.
Mike, your third question in the set.
Patricia, I really like where this work is coming from. I like where I think it's going. My question builds on a couple of the other questions from this side of the room in particular. And it's to sort of encourage you to think increasingly comparatively and thinking through the lens of property, not necessarily legal property, but property as a social relation. And I think like one of the things that you have really going for you is that you're working in a place that's really has really different property origins, as you've pointed out, from the slums of the world, right? It's not a landlord model. It's not whether we think of a tenement model like the private landlord or a banlieue model of the public landlord. It's essentially what you're describing as a smallholder model. And I'm guessing that it's way more complicated than that. I want you to see if you can think and talk us through that by way of two questions. Do people who are living in the favelas pay rent, whatever that looks like? And are there any evictions? And if so, why? And these are two questions that I think you're particularly well positioned to think about given your other research here. And so I just want to push you in that, maybe not right now, but in that
That's
broadly comparative.
great and very relevant. Timely question, I'll say. All right, so let me start. Effect of the urbanity and separating the commons, the urban from the commons, which I think speaks to Jeff's question too that I didn't address in kind of the broader commons literature. So I didn't want to separate the commons from the urban on purpose, right? Because that's what I'm trying to do, I guess. It's like, what does it mean to say urban commons as opposed to just commons, right? I mean, I see that you would want to engage with the commons literature to say this is different, right? And I have read that literature. But at the same time, if we go back on a slide here to show the things that I'm drawing from, see, all of these literature does not say urban commons, right? So I'm actually drawing a lot from just broader commons literature from a specific kind of line of thinking within the commons Marxist feminist scholars that and I'm drawing from them directly. I'm citing them in my writing, but I'm kind of trying to adding this little word in the front in thinking about urban commons. And I think your question of what is the effect of urbanity, I think spatially and territorially, right? Thinking about land in a non-urban area is very different than thinking about land. Yes, in a favela context, which with these realities are very dense, right? Very spatially connected dynamics that bring people a lot more closer together, right? So that bring that lead to specific types of relationships and engagements, the use of space, that alley, why is it so important? Because the space that is there, right, is the leftover space that people can hang out, that is not their house. So it's connected to their house, but is also kind of a public space, right? So I think that's the effect of urbanity, right? In a non-urban reality that you wouldn't have those kind of issues, right? So having those issues, what does it mean? Right, the specific urban commons. Do you see that kind of path I'm trying to go? I'm not sure if I'm there yet.
Separating out those particular points that are related to the urban aspect of it, it becomes much clearer what it means to be an urban commons as opposed to a common simpliciter or little one. But it also gets at, certain, like, generally that public health tends to be better in cities than in rural areas. A lot of evidence of that, right? And so, what influence does the demographics, the density of the population, the combination of expertise that you get from higher levels of population density, how does that factor into various sort of, whether spontaneous or planned policy decisions that go on?
Yeah, those are great points. Yeah. Thank you. All right, COVID. Thank you for your question. What's your name again? Angelina. Thank you so much for your question. That's a great question. And I think at least not to my knowledge, I think in Brazil, there was a lot less of that type of persecution to favelas specifically during COVID as an excuse. I mean, there were threats. There were communities that were being threatened for removal, but they were in specific neighborhoods, right? So there were other kind of dynamics that were playing a part in those threats. It wasn't just COVID, right? As it is in China, of course. But I think in terms of changing, I mean, I haven't actually done research on these questions of what are the changing perceptions? How does perceptions of favelas or of community organizations in favelas have changed because of COVID, right? I actually agree with you that, I mean, it wasn't necessarily a unique reality for favelas because they've been struggling to survive for hundreds of years, for over 100 years, right? So, and the solutions they created were built on solutions that already existed, right? So I don't think I'm asking you a question, but is there a good model for public health? I think if anything in this context, it strengthened these networks, it made them stronger. And a lot of favelas, because there wasn't any public funding, they had to pursue partnerships with private companies, right? So there was a lot of this company is looking for some good marketing. They would donate X amount of money for this community organization to buy masks or to cook 1,000 meals, right? And then they would mention the partner company X that funded, right? So if anything, I think it straightened, it made the networks of care, the organization stronger, right? Because of that need, right? They needed to do that. But it also, I think this speaks to other kind of efforts that I'm trying to think through is how they needed to rely on these external actors, right? That were not necessarily public actors to make that happen, right? They didn't, and I think that speaks to also some work on self-governance that I've done is that, yes, they govern themselves in many different ways, but they're not isolated, right? They rely on partnerships with private companies, with government, because they need those resources, right? So thinking about those networks, the self-governance or community governance is not one that is completely isolated within the spatial boundaries of the community. It's actually about kind of a network of connections and how those connections are able to be leveraged to bring improvement to the communities. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but we can talk more later.
It is 1:30. If people have to leave, leave. If you want to stay, stay. We will keep answering questions and going if that is possible. So yes, Mike, your next question. We'll do another one.
Yeah, so Mike.
That's fine. We can maybe give a quick thank you for those
Oh,
folks.
thank
who
you.
have-
Thanks so much for staying.
Yeah, no worries. It's a great discussion.
Yeah.
Only, we'll keep going. So the answer to Mike's question, and then we have a question from Julio, if that's still a question, Julio. Yes, okay, so.
So, Mike, that's a great question because I didn't speak about any of this, but that is a current change that has been happening in the last 10, maybe more years in favelas, which is people are building extra floors to rent, right? There are landlords and people do rent in favelas. And these dynamic, like upgrading projects really have a direct effect on tenant fees because usually rents go up, right? So people get displaced because they can't afford rent in that specific location anymore. And there are also like new research on rent in favelas is also finding these very large actually landlords that are absentee landlords that don't live there and that have acquired or built several different housing and that they're large scale landlords like the ones we have in other places, right? But they're the contractual kind of relation is a little different, right? Because the level of formality is very different. For example, so they do pay rent. A lot of people pay rent. So that's actually changing how favelas are being made today, right? So these processes that I described, I believe they still happen, and historically that's how favelas got made. But favelas are changing in the processes how they are made. They're not, a lot of new houses are not necessarily tied to these processes of social reproduction, right? So then, like, what does that mean for these networks, right? What does that mean for these communities? What are they losing, right? So I think there are a lot of questions that maybe I don't have answers to, but that people are thinking about, and I'm thinking about as well, especially as I moved to study evictions in Indianapolis. And I think property is something that I've started to engage more recently and think about property as a social relation, because I think there's a lot of potential in thinking about favelas historically and through these changes as well. So this historical work that I'm doing in trying to understand how they've been specialized further and further away from downtown relies a lot on kind of property geography literature. So I'm curious to see where that's going to take me. Continue.
Yes.
Your question.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, Patricia. Thinking and I commend you on this effort to theorizing, right? It's very important. In line with some of the comments that we have had, this idea of what to compare, tear apart, urban from the commons and all of that. When I see that definition, right, or those elements of a definition of an urban commons, the question that comes up to me is, okay, how are the urban commons different from the rural commons? Because I can see that in many rural places. And maybe, ways to start answering that can be thinking on, how for Ostrom's work, the commons existed and they kind of, stumbled upon it. And what they did is, there is rules about it.
Yes.
Right. So the institutions were crucial to understand the commons.
Yes.
And we haven't heard any of the institutions of this commons.
Yeah.
Right? So maybe that's why it's difficult for us to grasp what are these commons, how are they used? And you have thrown so many things at the commons, spatial or social reproduction, cultural reproduction, networks of care. Well, I'm guessing that there are rules for each one of those things. So why don't approach the commons from those institutions? And that's what they makes these commons what they are, right? The other thing is that if I think in your urban commons, I'm wondering, where does this proclivity to common efforts or collective efforts comes from? I'm wondering if this were a community that is well served by the government, right? With all the services like public parks, electricity, utility, everything, whether they would be any collective efforts. Right? So probably no, or definitely less than that. So that makes me think that this is more collective work to, provide services that are not provided by the government in spaces that are marginal and the government, not interesting for the government, as opposed to, what Ostrom found, more like, the commons are water, forests, this, that, and the other, that are resources. I'm using quotes here, right? So that's a very different thing. And also because I see how this urban commons, the collective work is creating value, right? They are starting to cement things on spaces that are not necessarily spaces of accumulation, right? Because they are marginal for the capitalists, the market are interested. This thing that you're changing about changes in the property, to me, that's super interesting because that is telling you that they are becoming spaces of accumulation. So that's going to change the nature of the commons. And I think that what we see is also how spaces where the rent of land is low, right? And they are becoming valorized by cheap or free collective labor. They are becoming a space of accumulation by which, there will be another further way of extraction of value, a surplus value, free value by these new landlords, because you have the appearance of a land market. So I think that's very, very interesting to think about how that transition is happening.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
No, don't stress. This is like a really
my forte, as you can tell.
No, that's okay. This question is maybe not worth asking, but so hopefully I'll
All
find
questions are worth
question by the time I'm done asking it. But I was really struck by the physical similarities between the areas that you're looking at in museums in Palestine. And so I was wondering if you thought about these as sources and forms of resistance as well, and how that might have things that we can extrapolate for these other contexts. Just because one of the things that you said about functioning as a resistance to these environmental and like ecological catastrophes as well is really interesting to me. But then also just like as a form of, integrating or like forming your own sort of governance system in spite of your relation to the state, rather than just like, sorry, no, that's the end of the question. Yeah.
What's your name?
Natasha.
Natasha. Thank you for that question. Okay, are there any other?
We have online.
Oh, yes.
Questions. I
Oh my
forgot
gosh, I'm
about
sorry.
about the queue.
Oh. Questions here. Okay. Right. So Julio, thank you for that question. I was also expecting that question. So I'll tell you another anecdote to answer your question is that when I was doing my PhD, I was really focusing on this question. I was using the idea of self-governance, right? Self-governance. How do communities govern themselves? And I did read Ostrom, and I had a colleague who was in part of my cohort, and he was using Ostrom's work to understand cooperatives in Ireland, right? And so I read Ostrom, and he like kept encouraging me. He's like, oh, I think Ostrom work would be really valuable to you. And in listening to my work, he kept asking me, like, what is the commons? Like, what is the commons here? And I couldn't answer his question. I was like, I don't know what is the commons. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't think I can answer that question. It's like I struggle to engage with that question. So and that was like before my field work, right? So it was specific context as well. But the reason why I don't engage with that type of analysis specifically is because I think epistemologically, maybe I'm coming from a different understanding of what the commons is, right? I don't understand the commons as a resource that is there and that we find it and then we share it whatever way we can. The commons is produced. Even if it is a resource, it's only a resource because we need it, right? It's a resource in relationship to the groups that are using it, right? So it's relational to the groups. It's not there as an isolated thing in the world, right? So that's kind of, I think, maybe how to approach and understand the idea of the commons in itself. And that's why I mentioned kind of Marxist feminist scholars that do define and understand the commons as a social relation, right? And that's kind of how I am understanding the commons in these contexts as well. And that's why I don't think I could have answered that question at the time. I didn't know this literature. And I was like, is it the space? Is it the alley? But then I was like, well, but the alley is not there, right? It's produced through these kind of social processes because of these conditions, right? So I think that comes, and I think I didn't use the word institution or rules, but in some of the stuff that I publish, there are institutions. The community organization is an institution in itself, right? There are rules, and this is not to say also that there's no conflict in these realities. There's plenty of conflict. I didn't mention them, but if I show you other pictures of the same community, there are some houses that have gates in the sidewalk. It's like, so people won't sit there. There's an area that people build garages and they have gates and they're like locks so people can park their car, right? So there are conflicts and rules, but that's social life, right? That's collective life. Those are conflicts that exist and are also part of that building of the collective, I believe, right? In trying to struggle through those conflicts, I would say. So I think in terms of the urban commons in relation to the government attention or government infrastructure, I think it's broader than the government. I think in also defining the commons through these lines of struggles for social reproduction, I'm being very intentional, right? And it speaks to your question, Natasha, and kind of practices of resistance for people's survival, right? So it speaks to their existence in the world historically, which has to do with the government, right? If you think about Rio and policing and how people die every day with police violence in favelas in Rio, not only Rio, right? But it also has to do with processes of urbanization and racial capitalism and dynamics of race and gender that are very present in these communities, like femicides, right, and violence against women. And the fact that some people would tell me, I don't say I live in a favela. I say that I live in the neighborhood by it because otherwise I won't get a job, right? So there are kind of, I think I'm rambling a little bit, but I think I think the main thing for me in thinking about your questions is how I'm choosing to approach and try to understand these realities from a different kind of epistemological understanding. And that will lead to different questions and different answers, right? But I would love to talk more. And I do agree with the question of accumulation and this new kind of trend, which it is very interesting to me as well.
I interject here just a little bit.
Yeah.
Natasha.
Don't have to leave, but this is your home. Adi can guide
Thank you so much, Diana.
You can ask Adi.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I have to run.
Don't worry, thank you.
Yeah, comparison of works. geographically separated and historically separated, but I often engage in. I was not to engage with that, but framework. I also find idea of the commons used in only one way very restricted. It is one way to use it in resource allocation and looking at institutions, but as you said, every society, and that's my anthropology speaking, every society has institutions. And some of these institutions are based on understanding how commonly used areas. That's how I approach commons. Speak to the wealth of the community or redistribute the wealth of the community and situate the individuals in that social product or social process. So I don't find that only one person, Ostrom, had the blueprint for
Yeah.
how we understand commons.
Yeah, and many other authors and scholars are engaging, right? I think her work is very important, right? I think she was speaking to a specific audience, right? And that's why she spoke of the commons and these relationships in specific ways, right? And I admire her work. I'm not dismissing it. I hope no one is taking it. I'm dismissing it.
Conversations
Yeah,
about
yeah.
how we expand the understanding.
And I think it would be actually a helpful exercise for me to like go back to her work and try to engage it like through this perspective. Like, what would that mean?
So no,
So I think that could be productive. But to your question, Natasha, I think there's a lot of connections that can be created and entangled and, because they are, at least how I am defining practices of resistance, right? So I think there are a lot of connections and also differences. Does that make sense? All right. Well, thank you all for staying here until for so long.
You.
And for questions.
Just think here, then it's still recording.
Did I answer your question?
I think I didn't super have a question. I'm physically how similar they look, how they function.